The Intercollegiate
Psychedelics
Network.
Alrighty, so Jay Nelson is an author, researcher, and award-winning screenwriter obsessed with three questions. What is consciousness? Number two, is there an edge of experience? And number three, how best to explain ecological awareness? After originally getting his start in acting, Jay soon found a love for psychology and explaining the human mind. But after a near-death experience realigned all his perceptions in 2013, he started moonlighting in neuroscience, philosophy, and evolutionary biology. He has been called a philosopher, a shaman, and a man of science, but in his own description, he's a moderately well-read person who wants to test the limits of human perception. And Lindy Nelson is a lifelong student of what makes a human a human. She has always believed that we are more alike than we are different, and is forever on the journey towards a better understanding of how to share that knowledge. From managing escape rooms to restaurants, film sets to corporate offices, she is adept at seeing all of the pieces that make up the whole. She leads with patience and the mantra that we should each use what we have to improve where we can. Thank you for being with us today, Jay and Lindy. The floor is yours.
Hi, guys. We are Jay and Lindy Nelson. We are the authors of Consciousness in a Nutshell, a Psychonautical Odyssey. And today we are doing the keynote address for the Philosophy, Culture, and Art section of the PsychedelX conference. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of our philosophy because, you know, what the book is ultimately is a book of philosophy, a marriage of science and philosophy that aims to help the reader understand what consciousness is. And so I'll begin like this. In 2013, I died. Okay, I had a near-death experience. It was, we could call it an overdose. The details aren't really important, but everything changed that night. You know, like my philosophy, how I relate to reality, how I relate to myself, everything changed that night. And I want to tell you guys about that experience. I don't want to tell you about the outdated philosophy that wound up making me want to, you know, almost kill myself. But I want to give you a taste of that, a glimpse of what the transcendent or mystical type experience is like, because, you know, we're all here, we're all psychedelic professionals. And the one thing that we've learned is that it isn't just that psychedelics are able to catalyze change in people. It isn't just the molecules themselves. It is this experience that they're able to give you. And so we'll back up into this experience in 2013. So a friend of mine named Callie and I, we decided we wanted to try acid for the third time, technically. The first two times we were sold DOB and told it was acid. It wasn't actually acid. So the third time I supposedly run across a guy who has the real deal and I purchase a 10 strip. Now, not knowing, this being like my first true experience with LSD, I didn't know how much to take, but I knew anything over 250 micrograms was going to be a lot. So, you know, these tabs being about 70 micrograms a piece, I took 3 of them. Callie takes 2. You know, about an hour later, we're not feeling anything. So we both take another one. And then about 45 minutes later, because we're not feeling it quite enough, we both split another one. So now let's flash forward to what 4.5 tabs can do to a person's psyche. So when we left this music venue, it offlined all of my memories. I essentially forgot everything. And when we wound up back at my Koreatown apartment, I had an experience that could only be described as a near-death experience, followed by an experience where I seemed to transcend the death of my ego. And we're going to talk about that today, because if you can explain this experience, just supposing someone could explain this ineffable, indescribable, words can't touch this experience, then effectively we'd be describing the thing that's powerful enough to break addictions, lift people out of depression, stop anxiety, and incite serious change in people. Now, how is that possible? So 450 millionths of a gram of some fungus derivative was enough to change the way that I would relate to this world forever. how can a molecule do that? Well, as we mentioned before, it's this transcendent or mystical type experience. And this experience is what people rate. 80 to 90% of people rate this experience in the top 5 of their life, right up there with losing a parent or sibling, having a child, getting married, or getting a divorce. So it's a pretty profound experience. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We wrote a whole book on this.
Now, we believe that the transcendent or mystical type experience is one of the most transformative experiences of a person's life. But what exactly is being transformed? Now, throughout our book, we discuss the spectrum that conscious states exist on, with the argument that by comparing enough of these altered states, you start to see a baseline for what consciousness really is. Now, our labor of love for the past 7 years, Consciousness in a Nutshell, is a multidisciplinary examination of the study of consciousness, because we believe that a subject so complex deserves a multifaceted analysis. Now, there are 5 major disciplines we support our research with. The first is physical. You are an embodied creature. You have a biological machine through which you experience the world. It cannot be denied or downplayed that there is a physical component to consciousness. But to simply say that consciousness exists from the neck up is doing a disservice to the conversation. That's why there's also mental, that head up portion of consciousness. There's also environmental. You co-evolved with the planet. Our brain and our body grew up in an environment. Therefore, you must discuss the environment when discussing consciousness. Then we go into cosmological. What is beyond our planet? The environment that our planet exists in. And then beyond that is the metaphysical. What is beyond the senses? What the universe ultimately, quote unquote, is.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with a go back to your share screen. Let you do this. And we're going to start with the spectrum of altered states. Okay. So basically our whole idea behind explaining like why this is a psychonautical odyssey, why we use psychonautics, studying transformations in consciousness to talk about consciousness, is because if you can explain properly a bunch of these states, then you start to understand what is being transformed, what is baseline, right? So just going to go through this real quick. On the far left of this spectrum, you're going to see something called CS5. Now, instead of writing normal, baseline, wakeful conscious state 1,000 times, we just labeled it CS5. So this is basically your normal waking consciousness as soon as you get up in the morning. You haven't had coffee, you haven't had a cigarette, you haven't had alcohol, you haven't had anything. This is normal consciousness. So there's a degree of intensity when it comes to this spectrum we're looking at. So on the far left, you have CS5, right? That's normal. On the far right, in the most intense experience you can have, we call that the transcendent or mystical type experience. And, you know, in the book, we kind of go through all these states, but today we're going to mainly focus on trying to gift the realization that comes from this transcendent experience. When you transcend the death of your ego, you see yourself and the world in a new and novel way. And we can talk about why that is. And one way to think about it is kind of like this. The neural substrates of the ego is what we call the default mode network. So it's a large scale network firing in your brain. And so when you're thinking about yourself, or you're thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow, or you're, you know, having imagination or fantasy in your mind's eye, if you're doing any kind of self-referential thoughts, self-referential thinking about self versus other modalities of thought, the default mode network is going to come on. Now, if you're in a flow state, and I'm sure you've all experienced a flow state before, flow states are defined as those peak states of performance when we're at our best, performing our best. And so when these flow states happen, what we don't experience is the self. We don't experience the ego chiming in and giving us self-consciousness. We just have consciousness without this inner critic that's judging our ideas or getting in the way of us performing at our absolute peak. So these are flow states, right? So flow states are kind of in the middle, and I like to talk about flow states because they're a natural, you know, state of consciousness that's very different from what our normal baseline is, but is just a shade, it's a shade of a transcendent experience. Because in a transcendent experience, there's a few hallmark themes we've discovered, just collectively, and that is timelessness. So your sense of time starts to melt away. Selflessness, your sense of self starts to melt away, and ego boundaries. So your self the boundaries that your ego would define you, like you end here, that goes away too. And so you can be trapped in a place where it feels like it's the only room that there is, a liminal space. Now, just to go through a couple of these real quick, just next to CS5, you'll find the experience of awe or trance. And so the easiest way to describe this one is, you're on a hike and you finally make it up to that rainfall. No, sorry.
Waterfall?
That waterfall. Thank you.
Rainbow at the waterfall. How about that?
Yeah. You finally check out that rainbow at the waterfall and it's so pretty. You can't even think anymore. You can't even finish whatever conversation you were having because what's in front of you is so beautiful. It's robbed your ability to speak. That's awe. You don't need any psychedelic to have an experience like that, but psychedelics can obviously give you many experiences of awe or trance. Runner's high. That one's pretty easy. If you run for over 15 minutes, then your body starts releasing its endogenous cannabinoids. We call that anandamide. So this is, an endogenous chemical your body will release. And if you're working out for 30 minutes, then it will release endorphins. So, but if you're in a flow state, your body is going to release dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, anandamide, noradrenaline, and sometimes oxytocin all at the same time. So it's a very rewarding state to be in. So just in a little more intense than that, you have your just regular psychedelic state. A little more intense than that, you have childbirth and extreme pain. She could probably talk about near-death experiences, which I've had. And then beyond that is the transcendent or mystical type experience. Care to add anything?
Specifically. So now we're going to go into exactly what is the default mode network and what exactly is being kind of smushed and twisted. We like to refer to this with an acronym called DEMP.
Yes. And so when you're talking about the architecture of a transcendent experience, there are 4 things that pop up. And so the mnemonic is DEMP. In quick form,
D, dissolvability of self.
Yeah. So it's dissolvability, elasticity, malleability, and lastly, possibility. So let's go at first. D, dissolvability. Dissolvability of established brain networks like the default mode network. So we all know, or if you read a lot of psychology and stuff, you'll understand that there's 3 basically large scale networks in the brain. You have your salience network, you have your central executive network, and you have your default mode network. Now, if any one of these networks gets hyperactive, like the default mode network, for example, you're likely going to have psychopathologies. If your salience network becomes hyperactive, you're likely going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. So when it comes to these large scale networks, you want them to be on more or less an even keel, because at the default mode network, the neural substrates of the ego is always hogging up all the resources and, stealing the spotlight of consciousness all the time, then that's what we call depression. People get depressed because they're ruminating, they're thinking about themselves too often. So the way that we can think about this is kind of like a screensaver that pops on every 3 seconds. Some people have this problem where they can't stay grounded and present in this moment. And so they keep thinking about something that happened in the past. So if you were worried about something that happened in the past, this is stealing your attention from the now, right? And that's going to lock you out of a flow state. But if you're 100% okay with your life story and there's nothing like traumatic that's stealing your attention, then you're going to drop into flow states more often. So if you're possessed by the memory system, we call that depression. If you're possessed by the imagination, we call that anxiety, because, as humans, there's a couple great things we have: powerful imaginations, powerful memory systems, but they can go out of whack. And so anxiety is nothing more than forward-thinking rumination. It's still rumination. It's just you're not ruminating on things that haven't happened. It's things that are going to happen, that might happen, that statistically can't happen, but that's what people worry about. So they have a problem with attention. And so, you could ask the question, why do psychedelics have such healing capabilities? And one great answer is they help us redefine how we attend to the world by redefining what our identity is. Now, identity informs how we pay attention to the world. And so we'll go back to this mnemonic: dissolvability of established brain networks. You get your default mode network dissolved, obliterated, knocked out for a little bit of time. And when the brain reconnects, hopefully it doesn't reconnect with as much, what would you say?
Emotional baggage.
Right. That your memories will have been recontextualized, and instead of it being 100 icons of pain sitting on the desktop of your user experience, they've been filed away and properly processed. Now, if the default mode network is doing its stranglehold thing on the brain, then these sorts of reevaluations aren't going to happen. So this is where psychedelics come into that. So that's dissolvability.
I would add one note. It's important to note that you're not suppressing these traumatic memories. You're just separating the emotion from the action of the memory. Therefore, you can deal with the emotion and deal with what happened separately without being emotionally stranglehold. Stranglehold, is that a word?
It is now.
A word's only a word if you say it enough times.
So yeah, that kind of leads into our second bit, which is the elasticity of attention. Now, just like a good flow state, a psychedelic state will show you how much attention you actually have. The neuroscientist Arne Dietrich has an idea called transient hypofrontality, and he talks about how when you get in this state, basically your mental life collapses into what he calls a mental singularity. So transient hypofrontality, which also happens during a flow state, is kind of described as your prefrontal cortex starts to wink out of existence. And because time is calculated inside the prefrontal cortex and in other spots of the brain as well, your ability to calculate time starts to melt away. So time melts away, self being the ego, the default mode network, that starts to melt away, leading us to the malleability of the internal experience, which is M. So the book does this in a longer form, but you just don't know how much model you're bringing to the table, how much internal model there is to consciousness until you get it, until you see it completely, I don't know, almost like the end screen, until it changes so much. You understand how powerful your thoughts are, your intentions are, how powerful your own word is. This is what we call the malleability of the internal experience. So this, the transcendent experience can really show you how much power we have with our internal narratives. And, it's shown to you through various images and experiences, but ultimately this is part of the transcendent experience that helps rewrite people, showing them just how much power they have. And then lastly, possibility. So yeah, possibility or possibility space. So that's fine. So in a transcendent or mystical type experience, people always talk about entering into the gates of heaven or satori or nirvana or moksha or transcendence, right? They talk about like you've entered into a physical place, but it isn't a physical place as much as it's a mental summer home, if you will. It's a psychological position that you enter into in your mind where all you see is ultimate possibility. So we call it the possibility space because it feels like a physical place. And so when you take all these things in the aggregate, dissolvability, elasticity, malleability, and possibility, this is what we argue changes people. It shows them, it makes them re-identify not with the smallest part of themselves, but with the largest part of themselves. And that's what we're about to talk about next. So I'm going to show you an illusion you've probably seen before, and it's called the Necker cube. It's a two-dimensional cube, but it looks three-dimensional when you look at it. And so Donald Hoffman has a great line, which is, when you're not looking at the Necker cube, which is the front of the cube? Is it this square or is it this square? Or if you're looking at this duck rabbit, when you're not looking at it, is it a duck or is it a rabbit? And the point behind this is vision isn't a passive process. It's an active process taking place inside your head. So edges, color, contour, shape, objects, motion, tracking, these are all internal processes happening inside your mind. So, if you're talking about how are psychedelics able to change, how are they able to make the walls breathe or something like that? Well, this is why, because vision isn't, you're taking in real raw reality. These aren't just little windows. Vision is an active process, and 95% of what you're seeing is actually internally generated imagery, and it's only about 5% retinal data. Nevertheless, we will get a bit the TED Talk. All right. So This next portion, it took me a really long time to write, and I haven't gotten all fully memorized, but
Where it starts here.
oh, you can go to the basically this.
Okay.
So I haven't got it all fully memorized, but this is basically the realization, the grand realization that everyone comes to on this transcendent or mystical type experience that ends up rewriting their lives. That, I mean, 10 years ago, I was an actor, and then I changed my entire life because I knew there was something more than just trying to recreate a character on stage. I wanted to live a less selfish life, and this is what I saw.
And when we say that most people had this experience, we aren't just making that up. We're basing this off of real life testimony. If you're familiar with the MEQ, which I assume most of you are, that is a series of questions that are asked after a psychedelic experience by therapists to see what your experience was like. And you'll find many of these themes throughout the questioning.
Exactly. Thank you for bringing that up, Lindy, because the MEQ 30, which I'm sure you've read before, if you haven't, look through it and just look at what is similar, like read between the lines about what these researchers are asking, and you'll understand that they know what this is. You know, people keep tapping into some sort of realm that is timeless, infinite, eternal. They have this overwhelming sense of oneness or unity, connection with something grander than themselves. What is this thing? This is the answer. This is the answer we'll give you. Okay. So in order to do this, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first is about diamonds. The second is about gold. And the third is about where we came from. So do you guys know where diamonds come from? Everyone raises their hand. Yeah.
I wish we could see hands. That's the one bad thing about this format.
I know.
We know you're out there.
Yeah. So I think with movies like Blood Diamond, it's not rare. It's common knowledge that diamonds aren't rare and that we can actually make them with as simple as 4 simple ingredients: carbon, pressure, heat, and time. That's it. And where we find conditions like these are deep down in the Earth's crust, a place geologists call the mantle. So down here, with pressures upwards of 725,000 pounds per square inch and temperatures of 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, coal gets compacted so hard that its carbon atoms are forced into a lattice-like structure. Therefore, under extremely difficult conditions, carbon becomes diamonds. Now, gold is actually a little more interesting of a story, and is actually more rare. And to explain where gold comes from, we're going to have to backtrack a little, but trust me when I tell you that it's worth it. Because once you understand the broad strokes about how the universe created itself, I'll be able to tell you my favorite story of all time, which is how we got here. So let's begin with a startling fact. We live in an ever-expanding universe. It isn't static. It isn't fixed. It's progressively getting larger and larger. And the way we started to figure this out was with a man named Edwin Hubble. The year was 1929, and aside from discovering a whole range of new galaxies, Hubble swung his telescope up towards the sky and noticed that all these points of light weren't just stars, but they were galaxies. And they were also redshifted, meaning they were moving away from one another. So when you rewind the tape, you find that all these galaxies eventually converged to a single point 13.82 billion years ago. And this is what we call Big Bang cosmology. Now, how do we picture a universe expanding? Well, you can picture it kind of like a big blob of raisin bread dough heating up in the oven. Now, as the dough starts heating up, the raisins start getting pushed further and further apart. And this is precisely what's going on in our universe. The universe is expanding and the galaxies are pushing away from each other uniformly in the same manner. So you rewind the tape and everything converges back to that single point 13.82 billion years ago, which we call the singularity. So this is a little simple depiction of the singularity, but you got to realize, and it's kind of a joke, right? But you got to realize that at this time, there wasn't time. There wasn't space, there wasn't mass or gravity, because at this stage in our evolutionary story, all the energy and all the matter that existed everywhere right now was once neatly packed and folded in on itself like the most epic IKEA box you ever saw. Then somewhere between 10 to the minus 36 and 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the universe first popped into existence, which is 0 followed by a decimal point and 43 zeros, the force of gravity wriggles free from the grand unified force, and the universe starts expanding rapidly, going from the size of a subatomic particle to the size of a golf ball almost instantaneously, expanding faster than the speed of light until 380,000 years later, when the universe actually looked like this. This is the cosmic microwave background radiation. And as you can see in this photo, there are, even in the early universe, so 380,000 years old, there's an imbalance of matter present. So even back then, the seeds to countless galaxy clusters were already on their way. The orange and red blobs in this photo, that's where more hydrogen was. Now, at this stage in our evolutionary story, it's important to add that the only elements that existed in the entire universe were hydrogen, helium, and trace amounts of lithium. There were no other elements, okay? So the universe was much more chemically homogeneous than it is today. So now let's flash forward 200 million years, because right around this time, 200 million years, that's when our first stars begin to turn on. 200 million years after this photo, clouds of hydrogen are starting to get pulled together because of gravity. Gravity is pulling clouds of hydrogen closer and closer together. And because the atoms of hydrogen are getting so close, they're causing friction and heat. They're bumping into one another. And eventually they reach 10 million degrees Fahrenheit. The protons in the helium atoms start to fuse, creating the second element on the periodic table, which is helium. So as you can see, top left, you have hydrogen. That's element number one with one proton and one electron, right? But then when two hydrogen atoms come together and fuse inside the heart of a star, it produces helium and releases a tremendous amount of energy in the process. And this is what our sun is doing every single day. It's combining atoms of hydrogen into atoms of helium and releasing a tremendous amount of energy, right? It's a nuclear furnace, a nuclear explosion going on over and over, all day, every day. And that's what the sun is doing. And so you can ask the question, it's like, well, what else is happening inside this star? Well, not only is it fusing elements into hydrogen elements into helium, but it's also fusing them into carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. In truth, this happens all the way down to iron. But when a star starts fusing elements into iron, that's the death note of a star, because iron doesn't fuse with anything. So once a star starts fusing elements into iron, the core starts to harden and crush in on itself from every single direction. It becomes too much for the star to handle. It explodes, and that's called a supernova. But what's important to note is that it's only during a supernova that atoms of hydrogen can combine and form really heavy elements like platinum, silver, and gold. So I want to pause for a second and just comment about how remarkable that is. We haven't known the true origin story of gold for very long, and yet it's always been a prized commodity, which makes that gold ring sitting on your finger a little more interesting now, doesn't it? To know that it was forged inside the heart of a dying star billions of years ago, that it then shot out from one of the most destructive forces in the entire known universe, crash landed on our planet, sat in the ground for billions of years until some species of ape removed it from the earth, melted it into a circle, and now it's sitting on your finger. Now that's the story of gold, and that's my second favorite story to tell. Now, if you're still with me, I'm going to tell you my favorite story to tell, which is how we got here. All right, let's recap. For the first 200 million years, the universe was basically cooling off from the initial explosion. It was mostly dark, but then stars started to turn on at 200 million years, okay? And then more stars ignited, and then more stars ignited, and then more stars ignited. Now let's flash forward about 9 billion years or so, because something interesting is about to happen in this region of the cosmos we call the Milky Way. Now, this is
image not to scale.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting to note about this particular star is that it was a third generation star. And so there was already such a rich milieu of particles and elements present for it to work with. So when our sun first started forming, it started whipping up all the dust and debris around it, creating planets and moons and ice and asteroids and rocks. And this is how our planet was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. So naturally, the solar system wasn't as neat and orderly as it is now, but let's flash forward another billion years or so, because about this time, something happens on that little ocean planet right there. So 3.5 billion years ago, that's where we are right now. The oldest fossils that we have records for exist. Okay, so life is at least 3.5 billion years old. We can say that definitively. Now, so we don't exactly know how this happened, but at some point, these molecules linked up in such a way that an organic replicator was born. And by that, I mean life came into being. Irrespective of how it happened, it was arguably the most primitive version of life that exists, something like bacteria. But thanks to a copying error in the replication process, this single-celled life form started spreading out, diversifying, and evolving into every single thing you see around you today. Plants, trees, mushrooms, bananas, people, orangutans, everything on this planet, everything came from that one seed of life. So how do we all know we came from the same origin? Because again, we all share that beautiful double helical structure we call DNA. What's more, if you really start to understand what life is on a fundamental level, ultimately we're reduced to the idea that life is really just energy and information that is alive and information that can make copies of itself. Now, when life is rather simple, like bacteria, it just makes copies of itself in a process called meiotic division. Basically, it just splits in half, and you've probably seen a million videos of bacteria doing this. The first 2 split in half, and then you have 4. And then those 4 split in half, and then you have 8. And then pretty soon, bacteria is all of your sandwich. So, and just to give you an idea of how fast this process can occur, the bacteria E. coli can divide itself every 20 minutes, which means from one parent cell, E. coli is able to create 1 million other copies of itself in about 7 hours. No eHarmony, no dating, no sex. They just swell up and divide, making an error in the replication process in about once every billion rungs of DNA, which when you think about it, almost sounds like too low of a mutation rate to even have an effect until you realize the amount of generations bacteria can get up to in a day, or 5,000 days, or 3.5 billion years. Because once you really start to appreciate the amount of geological time that happened between then and now, like complexity starts to become the rule, not the exception. So from this perspective, it seems inevitable that a random mutation would occur which allowed bacteria to develop the sorts of proteins necessary to sense the difference between light and dark, just as it was inevitable that a beneficial mutation like that would get passed on. Thus, however life got started, once it finally got going, it was constantly evolving, reconfiguring, and adapting itself to the ever-changing environment. Different forms of life started evolving different tricks to survive. Different tricks to survive eventually gave rise to speciation. And so from one seed of life, this essential life form began evolving down different evolutionary paths, in much the same way that every branch on a tree grows according to its individual trajectory, right? On top of that, just as many branches and twigs sometimes get blown off by the wind, the tree of life has also seen more than its fair share of destruction, given that 99.9% of all species once living are now extinct. In light of this fact, one way to start conceptualizing the way like a simple way to think about what evolution is like is to imagine that spherical shape sorter toy we all used to play with as kids. Perfect. If you were to imagine squeezing Play-Doh out from the center of this ball, what might we expect to happen? Well, it would come out looking like a triangle over here and a star over here and a rhombus over here. And this is the essential, like, quick version of evolution I want you to grasp. You know, the shape sorter toy being like the complex, ever-changing environment that's always setting up the shapes, and this malleable Play-Doh DNA stuff of life is being the thing that always finds a way. It can be a triangle, it can be a star, it can be a rhombus. Whatever the environment dictates, it will evolve itself to be that shape, right? Okay, now let's talk about sex for a second. Now, right.
All he drinks water.
So there was a time in this world where you didn't know what sex was. Remember that? And crazy as this next part sounds, but like there was a time when life didn't know what sex was. Because, you know, before 1.2 billion years ago, sex didn't even exist, wasn't even an option, which also means that prior to 1.2 billion years ago, all life on this planet spread through asexual reproduction, which can almost be better conceptualized as forms of cloning or growth, right? So now let's talk about how plants do it. So a lot of plants reproduce vegetatively by sending out suckers, right? So what happens is a parent raspberry bush will send out an underground root called a shoot, which grows out a few feet from the old raspberry bush and then pops up and is a new raspberry bush. But I got to ask you,
Is it a new bush?
is it really a new bush? I mean, I'm sure if you severed the root and then, gave it to your friend, it would feel like a new bush. But like, if you just looked underneath the ground, this just looks like growth, doesn't it? Like, this isn't reproduction the way we think about it. This is just growth. Strange as it might seem, but asexual reproduction of this kind is how all life spread for, until 1.2 billion years ago, because that's when life finally figures out a new way for increasing genetic diversity, which is sex. So males contribute half the genetic material, females contribute the other half. So in our species, once one female's egg has been fertilized, it subsequently grows inside the mother's belly until it literally becomes too much for her to handle. The baby is delivered, and what's the first thing the doctor does? He cuts the umbilical cord. He severs the root, and bam, you got yourself a new human, right?
But is it a new human?
But I got to ask you, is it a new human, or is this just a more refined version of growth? Okay. Now, I'm sure the legal system would finally recognize it as a new person the second we sever that umbilical cord. But just suspend that thought for just a moment as we simultaneously start reconsidering that raspberry bush. If we never severed the umbilical cord, which is kind of a gross thought, but just go with me here, wouldn't it be much easier to start viewing human reproduction as just a complex form of suckering? Because if we can accept that asexual reproduction of the type I just described is really just a different form of growing and staying alive, then by the same logic, couldn't we consider human reproduction as being just a more complex version of that, making sex really just another way for life to shuffle up its genes? From this perspective, I think it would suffice to say that asexual reproduction is really just growth, but way more fun. Sorry,
Less
sexual
fun.
reproduction. Yeah, thank you. She picked that up. All right. So one last example, and we'll wrap this whole thing up. In Utah, there's this species of trees that span for over 100 acres that look like this, okay? Now, it used to be that we thought that all these trees were separate individual trees until one day, someone looked underneath the earth and realized, no, they weren't all separate trees. They were actually all one tree. They all shared an interconnected root system, which means that this collection of trees sprawling for 106 acres all came from one seed. It weighs in at about 13 million pounds, and it's considered to be the largest living organism ever found. One organism they call Pando, which is Latin for I spread. Now, why am I talking to you guys about trees? It's because I think we're like Pando, but on the grandest scale. We might not be able to see the root system with our eyes, but we still feel it. And on a transcendent or mystical type experience, that is what you feel. You feel the interconnectedness of all things. It isn't this abstract thing in your head of, oh, all humans are 99.9% genetically the same. That's an abstract concept that you can learn in science, right? It's true. Any two humans on the planet are 99.9% the same. But if you have this transcendent or mystical type experience, you won't think about that fact. You'll feel it in every cell of your body. The only difference between me and her is 0.1%. And is that anything to argue about? I don't think so. So sometimes when you're too focused on the details, you can't see the forest for the trees. And it would certainly appear that amidst all the details of being a human, we miss the most important point of all, which is that we're all immensely interconnected. Evolutionary biologists have no problem talking about the tree of life as a useful concept that, like we're all related. But the thing they seem to fail to understand is that the tree of life is a living tree that we're all a part of and connected to. So all humans share a single common ancestor, the so-called mitochondrial Eve, who lived about 200,000 years ago. So saying that we're all cousins of each other, umpteenth removed, isn't some kind of charming metaphor. It's literally true. You're cousins with every single human being on this planet, just as you're more distant cousins with every animal, plant, or fungi that's ever lived too. And look, you know this is the case if you were looking at any detailed family tree, or if we never severed the umbilical cord, because at that point, the connection would be unmistakably obvious. All life on this planet is fundamentally related, and I can even see the roots that connect us all. But deeper than that, you're also a part of an unbroken line of energy that kicked off this whole thing to begin with 14 billion years ago. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to another. So if that's true, then we are nothing other than the same essential universe expressing itself as that fly, as you, and as me. Or put another way, we are not separate from this universe. We are this universe. A point that probably flies in the face of whatever your ego or narrative self would have you believe, but once the smallest part of your identity is allowed to die off, the ego/narrative self that says you're just a poor little me, you come to realize that you really are this universe. Quote, you did not come into this world, you came out of this world. Just as a plant flowers or an apple tree apples, the universe peoples. Alan Watts, philosopher. You want it phrased in a more scientific light? Then let's consider the 5 most common elements in the universe. Listed in their order of abundance, we have hydrogen, helium, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Now let's consider the 4 most common elements that exist in the human body. Now, elementary knowledge already tells us what the first 2 are, considering that we're mostly water. But when you rank order the elements to find that humans are made of, you find that they are 1-to-1 with the universe. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen. Now, if you can count, you probably realized that there's one missing, right? Helium. But helium is chemically inert. It doesn't bind to anything. So really, we can just put that one aside, and we are 1-to-1 with the universe. Isn't that something? So as Neil deGrasse Tyson once put it, not only do we exist in this universe, but it is the universe itself that exists within us. It's no coincidence that we are chemically the same as the universe because we are this universe. We are not separate from it. We are it. Of course, Western society has brought us up to believe that we're all individual snowflakes born into some kind of environment, but we're continuous with this universe in all the ways that I would like to show you. Truth is, we are this universe personified, which sounds a little bit better if you say the first 2 syllables of the word, pause, and then say the rest of the word. Or if you prefer the idea in picture form, then try re-examining this photo of eyes and nebulas once more. So nebulas, as you may or may not know, are giant clouds of hydrogen, are giant clouds of gas where young stars are born. These are stellar nurseries. Really take a second to pore over this photo and then imagine someone whispering in your ear, we are the universe looking back at ourselves. Because that's what the transcendent experience sounds like. It's that moment when you not only see the interconnectedness of all things, but you feel it as well. The comedian Bill Hicks used to say, we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. As you, as me, as that tiger at the zoo, it's all one continuous process. So when you put all this knowledge together, you find that people are really just an extension of this universe, just as an eye is merely an extension of your brain. An eye is a tool that the brain uses to see the outside world. And by the same token, a person is really just a tool the universe uses to know itself. We, the environment, Earth, you, me, we all come from that same Big Bang energy 14 billion years ago. It isn't that there's a universe and then there's us living inside it, because that would imply they're separate things. They're not. It's all one thing, one continuous blanket of energy that's unraveling itself throughout all of space and all of time. And once you know that, and you see that, and you experience that, there are no more lines. There are no more boxes, and there are no more problems with identity. I mean, why would there be? We're all the same thing, fundamentally. One of the fundamental aspects of every religion is do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And if you walk into the United Nations building in New York City, you will find a poster hanging on permanent display, which renders this same ethic of reciprocity, the same line in all 13 of the major religions. this one line, do unto others as you would have do unto yourself, this essential concept is rendered in all 13 of the major religions. So what is that telling us? Well, the philosopher Schopenhauer says it's telling us that we're breaking through to a metaphysical realization that we really are all one. The division between self and other is an illusion. And where does this illusion come from? The brain. And that's what we've come to understand. We really are all one. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, thanks
That
so
is
much.
that is a lot to pull together to take in.
We'll make the material available too.
Sorry,
Yeah,
a lot.
and we're
Book is
also
available.
recording it too, so we'll be able to post this on YouTube later. But yeah, thank you so much.
I think I'm gonna take
I
down the screen for Q&A.
Cool.
yeah, I have a question to start us off. I was just starting to write it down and think through this. But
Cool.
I'm curious. I mean, I have a couple of questions. Maybe we'll we'll go around a couple different things. But I'm curious if you have any hypotheses as to what it is. If we had to narrow it down to one thing, if we had to narrow it down, what do you think it is that makes some humans believe they are separate?
Well, I think it is the ego. I mean, now let's be clear about like the psychological definition of ego. The ego is the part of our psyche that manages the external demands of the environment and is self-conscious. So this isn't something that you're born with. This default mode network is something that unpacks as you develop in your life. So it's really kind of coming online around puberty and that sort of thing. So this default mode network is and your prefrontal cortex, which doesn't finish really unpacking in your head until you're about 25, right? So, these two parts of our brain, these help us stand back from the immediacy of the world. And it is always the ego that is the judge, that is defining self versus other, that is saying, not me, I wouldn't have done that. Like it is always the ego that says we should punish them. Like it creates the separation, literally. And this is a part of consciousness. In the book we talk about layers of consciousness, and there are layers of consciousness that can get offline. Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor, Harvard-trained neuroanatomist, suffers a stroke, and she experiences basically the same thing and writes about it in both of her books. She experiences a transcendent or mystical type experience, and that part of her brain that's in the left hemisphere that was defining edges and borders and boundaries got completely offline, and she felt one with the life force of the universe. She calls it infinity. Interesting.
And of course, there are social implications as well. That especially, I believe, the millennial generation especially was taught we are all unique, beautiful snowflakes, and you all have unique contributions to give to the world, which we all do because we are all parts of the whole. The whole needs every part.
Yeah.
But it's not that we are separate individuals; it's that we are all parts of the same whole.
Okay, yeah.
I have sorry, go ahead.
That was done.
I sort of have a cultural question. So I think sort of the way that you wrap your head around this is looking at, I guess, sort of Darwinian science and the way that we had prior to that in a historical context, seeing people as individualistic, as we are sort of in a space of higher than the animals, so to speak, and sort of Darwin broke that down. Do you think that this sort of framework is just another evolution of that, of, I guess, dissolution of physicalism, of we are distinctly one thing that is different than another?
Understand the tenor of the question.
Yeah, let me get to the meat of it.
Okay.
I guess,
cool.
What do you feel like the implication of sort of this frame of the dissolution of all things, of, okay, I am you, you are me? What do you think that understanding contributes to culture? To how do we sort of come about figuring out what that exactly is?
Well, I mean, what that made me think about is we had talked about the evolution of consciousness, but we didn't really talk about
Yeah.
the consciousness of evolution, and that's part of the talk. So
Okay.
the big twist on the consciousness of evolution is this: it isn't that evolution is some abstract idea that Darwin, gave us a method for in 1859. It's that we are evolution. We are evolution incarnate. So the consciousness of evolution is that we are directing our own evolution at this moment in time. Sir Julian Huxley has a great line, which is evolution has become conscious of itself. Alan Watts is another great line. Man is nature becoming conscious of itself. So the problem with the philosophy of most of the world is that we've separated man from nature. We've separated humankind from nature. We've pictured ourselves as something separate in this evolutionary tree, but the idea is that it's not that this tree of life is conscious in one twig called Homo sapiens. It's that the entire tree is conscious. It's levels of awareness, right? So, like we're on one little bit of the tree and we are conscious, but every other point on the tree is conscious as well. It's just different levels of awareness. Now, as far as we know, we seem to have the most self-reflexive, complex consciousness out there. We can think about thinking. We can experience existential anxiety, anticipatory regret. Shit that hadn't even happened yet. We can suffer because of it. This is a complex machinery that's happening up here. But ultimately, we are evolution. What do you want to say?
I was just saying, did that get to the heart of your question? I feel like there was almost what do we do with that information element?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I feel like you have distilled sort of a lot of the ephemeral things that people have experienced in a one way, shape, or form in a state of psychedelics, or another voluntarily entered state of selflessness. Things like meditation, things like lucid dreaming or dream states. And yeah, sort of bringing that information back. It's definitely, sort of tying back into what Alex was saying, people don't connect with that. Like, how do we tie that back into our sense of selves and like integrating that into our modalities of therapeutics, of medicine, of self-discovery? Because it's a lot to sort of try to process that. That's all these different layers of conscious experience.
Yeah, and that's why he can talk a little bit more about like the structure of how we set up the argument in the book. But with that in mind, we've approached the material from every angle we could possibly imagine, with that attempt to try and reach more people, because not everyone connects with the science, not everyone connects with the metaphysics, not everyone connects with the physio or the ecological implications. But if you combine all of those together and see and can show that from all angles you get to the same conclusion, we're hoping that will open more minds.
And it's not just like Jay and Lindy think we're all one. You can find this idea popping up in so many different cultures throughout all of time, and it's not just that Jay and Lindy had over 40 mystical type experiences, which is true, but like that humans are biologically wired to have these experiences. We're capable of having quote unquote religious experiences or transcendent experiences or seeing nirvana or seeing heaven or the beatific vision. You can label it anything you want to. Ultimately, it's the same, experience. And so people play different language games, and that's fine. And so part of the reason why the book is 380 pages and not less is because we have to play all those language games at the same time. And talk about how people are talking about these experiences and they sound separate, but then underneath it's the neurobiology is very similar between a flow state and a transcendent experience. In both states that default mode network is not going to be active. I think there was something else, but that's it for now.
I'm kind of curious. I want to also maybe reframe Peter's question too, because I think I just got something of it. So I'm a social psychologist, and part of our field, one of the people in my department is more of a cultural psychologist. So we go kind of in that direction. So one of the things that just occurred to me to reframe Peter's question is something you mentioned during your talk was that like Western society kind of raises us up, especially millennials, to be kind of believing that we're separate, unique, these other things. And so like in our culture, there's this kind of stigma or this perspective that we are separate, we are unique, different, etc. And so now we're having this realization that we're coming to, I mean, part of it's coming through science, but like plenty of cultures, plenty of perspective have already kind of had this as a major piece of their belief system, that we are not separate, that we are all one. So I guess to reframe the question is like, American culture, Western culture has had this perspective that we're separate, and how could it change, or how might it change, or what would be maybe an ideal way for it to change now that we're having this other kind of realization coming. And I could also connect this to like past times in history where like, we realized like the earth is not the center of the galaxy or something. And like, there's these times when like these realizations happened by a scientist, and then like the culture was like, that's heresy, that's not true, we've believed this other thing for a while. And so like, I don't know if that's an appropriate thing to compare it to, but I guess, yeah, have you guys thought about that, of like the cultural, there's like definitely cultural resistance to that, but yeah, how might it change?
Definitely cultural resistance, but I do feel like we're naturally leading there. There's discussion of psychedelic renaissance right now, but even outside of that, a lot of it relies on the destigmatization and the depolarizing. We're starting to discuss things in terms of a spectrum. And I think that is very important. If we continue discussing things in terms of a spectrum and stop talking about sides, stop talking about A and B, about mine and yours, about theirs and theirs. It's not me versus you, it's ours. And
self, and Alan Watts would say self implies other, like,
yeah.
You only like, there's a thing called like the myth of the individual, because I don't know who I am. I only know myself through relationships with other people. I discover what I believe by having a good conversation with someone. So yeah, I just wanted to add that part.
Yeah, continue emphasizing the discussion of the spectrum. Continue emphasizing the realization that we are figuring it out, that we don't know what A and B are. So stop talking about A and B. Stop talking about me and you. Stop trying to identify things that we don't have identifiers for.
But then, like this ultimate metaphysical realization that people come to on these psychedelics, like they can remember it or not, but it changes their outlook, and it changes the way that they, re-identify with life. Because if you identify with the life power of the universe, if that is your like almost first name, then it isn't, because I feel like pre-psychedelics, you might order your identity with like, maybe race, gender, socioeconomic status, relationship status, like, you can put these in any kind of stack you want to that makes sense for you. But ultimately, it's this transcendent experience that dissolves all of your categorical structures, dissolves all of your religious certainties, gets you back to base floor one. And it's like, oh, you and me are the same thing, but we play in this reality where we're not. So can I hold on to both perspectives? Can I hold on to this metaphysical realization that we actually are all one in this non-dual spot, or this unity spot that I've ascended to? But when we come back down and our brains become less connected as we're coming off these psychedelics, then, the ego starts coming in. And this is where integration and practice all, comes in. It's like, okay, how do I integrate this 4-dimensional wisdom that we're all one in now into this 3-dimensional reality where you're over here on the different side of a laptop than me? Like, how is that possible now? Well, if you can live with both viewpoints, I think that's the ideal way to live. Live knowing that what we're experiencing right now is a game. This is a dream in a way. And it's amazing. It's perfect. And I think that, that is what cures people. It's realizing the great grand symmetry of being. That's nirvana. And then realizing that infinity, or nirvana, like there's no difference between the two. This moment is also nirvana. I'm just choosing not to experience that.
And so I do think we are on the path, but in discussing these topics, especially with other Westerners, it is important to keep in mind that everyone is on they're on their own different part of the path. We are all on the same path, but we haven't yet all realized we're all on the same path, and not everyone is on the portion of the path that you are on.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about a lot with some of my colleagues is the idea of learning to embrace paradox, because I think what you were just describing of like the paradoxes that come up of both the realization that we are all one, but then like we're also kind of separate in physical form or something. Like there's these kind of dualities that are, or paradoxes that arise that are kind of like, okay, both of these things are true, but even though they seem to contradict each other, and I think that there's a skill of being able to embrace that paradox, because in my field we have something called cognitive dissonance, where like if we have these things that are dissonant with each other, it typically arouses this uncomfortable state that we try to reduce in certain ways. But I don't know, I think sometimes about how maybe learning to embrace certain paradoxes at least is a certain form of like, I don't know, I don't want to moralize it or something by calling it like maturity, makes it like a psychological maturity, makes it sound like it's like you're better if you do that, but I don't necessarily believe that. But I don't know, it seems like something that comes out of the psychedelic state sometimes is that people can kind of embrace paradox a little bit more.
For me, that paradox nests comfortably inside the statement that you are the universe experiencing itself. All of us are the universe experiencing itself. We're different iterations of the universe. We're basically, the universe wants to experience all of itself. So it gives itself all of these infinite little fingers, that's what we are, to go out there and touch and feel and smell and run. And the universe can have a much grander experience if it has billions of little fingers doing that as opposed to one.
And one way to think about that, like in our reality right now, is think about a tree, right? So, a tree, if you look at a tree on like a hill or something like that, from a very far away perspective, it's one entity, it's a tree. But then when you zoom in on one particular leaf, like you could get lost in the intricacies of the leaf. And each leaf has its own memory system, right? If you burn a leaf, like with a magnifying glass, a little mark will remain. So there's a form of memory there, right? So, but the problem is that we all are born into this life and we feel like we're individual leaves and we're not attached to a tree. We forget that we're attached to a tree. And so the great grand realization is on a psychedelic or just nirvana is you aren't the tree. I'm sorry, you aren't the leaf. You are the whole tree. So even if this leaf, this body, if you don't identify with the body anymore, you identify with the consciousness, which you are. So that is the energy that kicked this whole thing off 14 billion years ago. So that's what you need to identify with. If you can identify with that I am the tree, I am the energy, then I never die. I am immortal. And that's what helps people with end of life anxiety. We talk about, psychedelics and for terminal cancer and that sort of thing. This is what it shows people. It's okay, because the great question of like life, the grandest question I think is there design or isn't there? And every religion, you distill down every religion to one sentence, and here it is: there is some sort of unseen order, so have faith. That's every religion in a nutshell, in one sentence. And what is scientists saying? Right? They're saying, well, there was extreme order 13.82 billion years ago, and it's gotten progressively more disordered as time gone on. So are we saying the same thing or not? Religion is saying there is order. Scientists are saying there was order. Like at the, the way that we marry these is to realize how we, I guess, get over this religion evolution divide is that we are evolution. We are the universe. The universe is evolving. Big Bang cosmology is a description of how the universe evolved, not how it began. And that's what it's still doing. It's still evolving. And now it's going to stop talking.
Man, there's so many things in there that I would love to touch on. We're getting close to out of time, but I want to take these. We have these two questions that came in. I'll bring them both up to you, and you can answer them however you would like. So the questions are: what are your thoughts on psychedelic experiences of the human commonality facilitating discussion, and the understanding between people with polarized religious and political views? So I think the question is basically, if I'm understanding correctly, do you think psychedelics can help people come together who have polarized religious political views? That's the first question. Second one is, what is your opinion on achieving a higher sense of consciousness in the context of the socioeconomic hierarchy of the world? So whether you want to answer both of those or pick one of your favorites, we have a couple minutes here left.
I can take the first one, or at least start on
go
it.
for it.
So can psychedelics sort of break down the polarity between religion and politics? I believe absolutely yes. I can go into broader examples, but even if you just look at the two of us, when we first met, different ends of the political spectrum, and I was raised a very, very, very strict Christian. What psychedelics did is it didn't strip me of that identity. It just helped me reframe it. And I think that's what they do, is it helps you take all of this prior knowledge that you've built your philosophies on, and it doesn't say you can't believe any of that. It just helps put it into grander context to be like, it's not just about the relationship between you and this indescribable figure in the sky. It's about your relationship with, it's about everyone's relationship with everyone. When I got more, do you want to go though?
Just about it helping people connect more. It is, so we all kind of like start with the same consciousness, if you will, and then it is our memories, more specifically our interpretations about our memories, that create belief filters by which we see the world. So we could be in the same room together, but I might notice way more like just different things because of my background. And you might notice, you're probably going to notice different things because of your background. So we're always seeing through our individualized histories, but psychedelics reliably produce an experience where you don't have any memories anymore. So your ability to define, classify, rank, list, categorize is gone. And so, when that happened to me, it was no longer was my brain seeing this other life form next to me that was so different, this girl, and I was judging her because of her background, and I'm judging her because of like things she's done, and like instead of all this layered judgment, it just melted all away, and I was able to connect. All my categorical structures dissolved, and it was like, this is life, and this is life. Why can't I just appreciate the 99.9% view instead of focus on the 0.1% I always focus on? And that's how it made me have a bigger heart and, cracked me open, because it's like, it is my narrative self that is blocking me from connecting with another human being. It's the judgment. It is my judgment, because I'm a judgmental person, that's destroying my relationships. And so then you get to practice that. Okay, well, why can't I see myself in this person? And I think the more questions like that people ask themselves, then we can stop being so polarized.
One more point on question one. Another thing is that, I just had it. I just lost it. Sorry, keep going.
That's good.
To actually remind me of that one.
Alrighty. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Jay and Lindy, for coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any last comments or things you would like to leave the audience with, places they can find you, any messages you would like to get off before we move on?
I'm sure I'll start with where you can find us, and then we'll end with closing. You can find us anywhere online at consciousnessinanutshell.com. Our handles are all consciousness in a nutshell, all one word. We'll also share some ways you can find us in the deck.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then as far as signing off, it's been great to have you.
Thank you so much for having us. This was incredible. This is our first time we actually got to go through this entire TED Talk, if you will, in one sitting. So we're very happy. You guys are the first ones to really hear this. Yeah. So thank you for all your attention. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be sharing everything later. This talk is recorded, so we'll put it on YouTube and everything, and we'll share it with you so you can share it with whoever you would like to as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Stay curious.